My name is Charmaine Ellis, and the day I woke up in a hospital bed after emergency surgery was the day I discovered that the man I trusted most had already started dismantling my life. The last thing I remembered before the operation was a doctor shouting instructions while nurses rushed me through a hallway under blinding fluorescent lights. My appendix had ruptured unexpectedly, and by the time I reached the hospital, infection had already started spreading through my abdomen. The pain was so intense that I could barely breathe. I remember squeezing my husband Darnell's hand as they wheeled me towards surgery. I remember hearing him promise that everything would be okay. I remember believing him. Then darkness swallowed everything. When I finally opened my eyes again, the room was quiet. Too quiet. Machines beeped steadily beside me. My mouth felt dry. My body felt like it had been cut in half. Every movement sent sharp waves of pain through my stomach. For several seconds, I simply lay there trying to understand where I was. Then I looked toward the chair beside my bed. Empty. I frowned. Darnell should have been there. He knew how terrified I was of hospitals. During our 13 years of marriage, he had never missed a major medical appointment. Even when I gave birth to our son years earlier, he had practically refused to leave my bedside. At first, I assumed he had stepped out for coffee. Maybe he was speaking with a doctor. Maybe he was calling family members with an update. I reached for my phone on the tray beside the bed and checked the time. Nearly 6 hours had passed since the operation. 6 hours. Confusion slowly gave way to unease. I sent him a text. No response. 10 minutes later, I called. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Same result. By the end of the afternoon, I had called 12 times. Nothing. The nurses noticed my growing anxiety and tried reassuring me. One suggested that my husband might simply be dealing with a dead phone battery. Another said family members sometimes stepped away after long surgeries to get rest. Their explanations sounded reasonable, but something deep inside me refused to settle. Darnell was many things. Forgetful, stubborn, occasionally selfish. But disappearing without a word while I recovered from emergency surgery was not normal. The next morning, I woke to another surprise. A billing representative entered my room carrying a tablet and a folder. At first, I assumed she was there to verify information. Instead, she asked if there had been recent changes to my insurance coverage. The question immediately caught my attention. Not that I know of, I replied. The woman hesitated before explaining that several claims connected to my treatment were encountering problems. Coverage authorizations that should have processed automatically were showing unusual restrictions. She apologized and promised the hospital would continue investigating. Once she left, a cold knot formed in my stomach. Darnell handled most of our insurance paperwork. He always insisted he was better with administrative details. I trusted him completely. Suddenly, I wasn't sure I should have. I spent the rest of the day trying to reach him. No answer, no text, no voicemail, nothing. Late that evening, my younger sister Monique arrived carrying flowers and a worried expression. The moment she walked into the room, I knew something was wrong. She tried smiling, but the effort looked forced. After several minutes of awkward conversation, I finally asked the question neither of us wanted to discuss. Have you heard from Darnell? Monique looked away. That single reaction told me more than words ever could. Slowly, she pulled out her phone and showed me a photograph someone had posted online earlier that day. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Then my heart stopped. There was Darnell standing in front of an upscale restaurant, holding a champagne glass and smiling. Beside him stood Shanice. I knew exactly who she was, a woman from his consulting firm. A woman he repeatedly assured me was just a colleague. The timestamp showed the photograph had been uploaded less than 3 hours earlier. While I lay recovering from surgery, my husband was attending a celebration. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. My mind kept searching for alternative explanations. Business event, work dinner, client meeting, anything. Then Monique quietly swiped to the next image. This one showed Darnell with his arm around Shanice's waist. The third image showed them boarding a private shuttle headed toward the airport. My chest tightened so hard I thought something might actually break inside me. Where are they going? I whispered. Monique swallowed nervously. Chicago. The room suddenly felt smaller. The air felt heavier. Every promise Darnell had ever made seemed to replay inside my head at once. The vacations we planned. The retirement dreams we discussed. the future we built together. All of it started collapsing in real time. Still, part of me refused to accept what was happening. I called his number again. Voicemail. I sent another text. No response. Then, just after midnight, my phone vibrated. Relief flooded through me so quickly it almost hurt. Finally, Darnell was calling. My hands shook as I answered. Instead of hearing his voice, I received a message. Just one message. No apology. No explanation. No concern about my surgery. No concern about whether I was alive. The text contained only 12 words. I need space. Don't make this harder than it already is. I stared at the screen in disbelief. 12 words. 13 years of marriage reduced to 12 words. Tears blurred my vision, but something stronger than sadness was already beginning to rise beneath the shock. Because for the first time, I wasn't just worried about where Darnell had gone. I was starting to wonder what else he had taken with him. And deep down, I had a feeling the insurance problem was only the beginning. The morning after Darnell's message, I stopped crying. Not because the pain disappeared, not because the betrayal hurt less, but because survival leaves very little room for self-pity. I spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our marriage, searching for signs I should have seen earlier. By sunrise, one uncomfortable truth had settled into my mind. Men don't disappear overnight unless they've been planning their exit for a very long time. The realization changed everything. Instead of asking why Darnell left, I started asking what he had been preparing before he left. Around 9 that morning, another hospital administrator entered my room. Unlike the billing representative from the previous day, this woman looked visibly uncomfortable. She carried several documents and avoided direct eye contact while explaining that there were continuing issues with my insurance provider. Certain authorizations had been canceled. Coverage categories had been modified. Some claims were being flagged for manual review. At first, the information sounded like bureaucratic confusion. Then she mentioned something that made my pulse spike. The policy changes had been submitted nearly 6 weeks earlier. 6 weeks. I immediately sat upright despite the pain shooting through my abdomen. 6 weeks ago, I had been perfectly healthy. 6 weeks ago, Darnell and I were still discussing summer vacation plans. 6 weeks ago, he was still kissing me goodbye every morning before work. Yet somehow, 6 weeks ago, major changes had already been made to my medical coverage. The administrator apologized again before leaving. The moment the door closed, I picked up my phone and logged into our insurance portal. What I found made my blood run cold. Several protection levels had been reduced. Additional coverage riders had been removed entirely. Emergency care protections had been downgraded. Most alarming of all, the electronic authorization records showed that Darnell had personally approved every modification. I stared at the screen for nearly a full minute. He knew exactly what he was doing. These weren't random administrative mistakes. These were deliberate decisions. Decisions made while he smiled across the dinner table and asked about my day. Decisions made while pretending to be a loving husband. The deeper I looked, the worse everything became. My next step was checking our joint bank account. At first, I couldn't access it. The login credentials had been changed. That alone was enough to trigger panic. After several failed attempts, I contacted customer support and completed identity verification. The representative restored temporary access. I wish she hadn't. The moment the account loaded, I felt physically sick. The balance displayed on the screen didn't make sense. For years, Darnell and I maintained a healthy financial cushion. We weren't billionaires, but we were comfortable. Between savings, investments, and emergency funds, we had built a secure life. Now most of it was gone. Not spent gradually, not invested elsewhere, gone. Transaction after transaction filled the statement history. Large transfers, international wires, cash withdrawals, account closures. Every line felt like another punch to the chest. By the time I finished scrolling, nearly $80,000 had disappeared. My hands started shaking so badly that I almost dropped the phone. I called the bank immediately. The representative confirmed that all transfers appeared properly authorized. Every document carried valid credentials. Every request followed required procedures. According to the bank, nothing looked suspicious. According to me, my husband had robbed me blind. The worst part wasn't losing the money. It was realizing how carefully everything had been planned. These weren't desperate actions made during a midlife crisis. The transfers stretched back months. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Then entire accounts emptied in stages. Darnell wasn't running away from our marriage. He had been dismantling it piece by piece while I remained completely unaware. That afternoon, Monique returned to the hospital carrying coffee and a legal pad. The moment she saw my face, she knew something had happened. I handed her the phone. She spent several minutes reviewing account records before slowly lowering the screen. "Charmaine," she whispered, "this wasn't spontaneous." I nodded. We both knew it. The evidence was impossible to ignore. Then she pointed toward one particular transaction, a wire transfer completed just 3 days before my surgery. The destination account belonged to a limited liability company registered in Illinois. Neither of us recognized the company name. Curious, Monique searched public records. Less than 60 seconds later, she found it. The company had been formed only 2 months earlier. One listed officer, Shanice Walker. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Everything suddenly started connecting together. The affair, the insurance changes, the missing money, the Chicago trip. This wasn't a romance. It was a business plan. Darnell and Shanice weren't simply running away together. They were building something funded with money stolen from our marriage. A terrible thought entered my mind. If they were willing to take $80,000, what else had they taken? The question refused to leave me. Late that evening, while scrolling through recent account activity, I found something even more disturbing. Several electronic document requests had been processed under my profile during the previous month. I didn't remember signing anything. I didn't remember approving anything. Yet the records showed multiple authorizations linked to my name. Some involved financial assets. Others involved administrative rights. One involved property management access. Suddenly, my chest tightened for an entirely different reason. My grandfather's commercial building, the building worth millions, the building currently held inside a family trust. The building Darnell knew represented the largest asset connected to my name. A feeling of absolute dread settled over me. Because if he was willing to steal $80,000 from our accounts, there was no reason to believe he would stop there. And for the first time since waking up from surgery, I realized the money wasn't the real target. It was only the opening move. The moment I saw the property management authorization attached to my profile, every instinct inside me went on high alert. Most people would have focused on the missing $80,000. Most people would have spent days grieving the collapse of their marriage. Under normal circumstances, I probably would have done the same. But something about that document felt different, more dangerous. Money could be replaced. Trust could not. And the building connected to my grandfather's estate represented far more than either of those things. It was the foundation of my family's wealth. A 4-story commercial property in downtown Atlanta that had survived recessions, market crashes, and 3 generations of ownership. My grandfather spent 40 years building it. My mother inherited part of it. Eventually, the trust structure placed management authority in my hands. Darnell knew exactly what that building meant. He knew its value. He knew its history. Most importantly, he knew it generated enough income to support an entire family for decades. My pulse accelerated as I opened the authorization records. The first document appeared harmless, a request to update management contact information. The second involved temporary administrative access. The third made my stomach drop. It granted authority to negotiate asset-related transactions on my behalf. I stared at the screen in disbelief. The electronic signature attached to the document carried my name. But it wasn't mine. The shape looked close enough to fool a computer system, close enough to pass a routine review, close enough to deceive people who didn't know me personally. Yet I recognized the differences immediately. Darnell had spent 13 years watching me sign checks, birthday cards, legal forms, and tax documents. He knew exactly how to imitate my handwriting. The realization felt like ice spreading through my veins. He hadn't simply stolen money. He had forged my identity. I immediately contacted the trust management company. After navigating 3 departments and 20 minutes of hold music, I finally reached a senior account representative named Kenneth. At first, he treated the situation as a routine inquiry. That changed the moment I informed him that several authorizations may have been submitted fraudulently. His tone became much more serious. After verifying my identity through multiple security procedures, he began reviewing the account history in real time. The silence on the other end of the line lasted nearly a minute. Then Kenneth asked a question that nearly stopped my heart. Mrs. Ellis, did you personally approve preliminary sale discussions regarding the Peachtree commercial building? For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Preliminary sale discussions. The words echoed inside my head. No, I finally answered. Absolutely not. More silence followed. Then Kenneth informed me that inquiries from multiple investors had been submitted over the previous 6 weeks. Confidential financial records had been requested. Property evaluations had been ordered. Preliminary conversations regarding acquisition structures had already begun. Every single request appeared supported by documentation carrying my authorization. I felt physically sick. Darnell wasn't preparing to borrow against the building. He wasn't trying to refinance it. He was preparing to sell it. The room suddenly felt smaller, harder to breathe in. That building wasn't just real estate. It represented my grandfather's life work. The rental income funded educational scholarships for several younger relatives. It supported elderly family members. It paid trust obligations established decades earlier. Selling it without proper authorization would create financial chaos extending far beyond me. Kenneth continued speaking, but I barely heard him. My mind was already racing through possibilities. How much access had Darnell obtained? How many people were involved? How close had he come to succeeding? After ending the call, I immediately contacted my attorney, Renee. We had worked together years earlier during trust restructuring. Unlike most lawyers, Renee never wasted time with false reassurance. She listened carefully while I explained everything. The missing money, the forged signatures, the insurance modifications, the property authorizations. By the time I finished, she was silent. That silence worried me more than panic would have. Finally, she spoke. Charmaine, this sounds organized. The words landed heavily. Organized. Not impulsive. Not emotional. Organized. She explained that most affairs create personal damage. Most divorces create financial disputes. What I was describing sounded different. It sounded like someone had spent months positioning assets, altering documentation, and building legal cover before executing a coordinated exit. In other words, Darnell may have started planning this long before I ever entered that operating room. The thought made me nauseous. Every anniversary dinner, every family gathering, every vacation photograph. Had he already been preparing to betray me during all of those moments? Before ending the call, Renee instructed me not to sign anything. Not electronically, not physically. She also promised to begin emergency legal action immediately. For the first time since waking up from surgery, I felt a small sense of control returning. Unfortunately, it didn't last long. Less than an hour later, my phone buzzed with a new email notification. The sender belonged to a commercial real estate brokerage firm. The subject line read, "Final investor meeting confirmation." Confused, I opened the message. Attached was an agenda outlining a private dinner scheduled for 3 days later in Chicago. Several investors would attend. Representatives from financing groups would be present. Legal teams would review transaction structures. And at the very top of the document sat the words that made my blood run cold. Acquisition of Peachtree Commercial Building. Estimated valuation, $5.2 million. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. Darnell wasn't planning to sell the building someday. He wasn't exploring options. He wasn't gathering information. The deal was already moving forward. Investors were flying in, meetings were scheduled, lawyers were involved. And unless I stopped him, my grandfather's legacy would be sitting on a negotiation table in Chicago within 72 hours. At that exact moment, I stopped thinking like a betrayed wife recovering from surgery. I started thinking like someone running out of time. For the next hour, I sat motionless in my hospital bed, staring at the investor agenda on my phone. 72 hours. That was all the time separating my grandfather's legacy from a conference table in Chicago. 72 hours before strangers started negotiating over a building that never belonged to Darnell. 72 hours before forged signatures and fabricated authority became millions of dollars in irreversible damage. The more I thought about it, the more impossible the situation became. I was recovering from emergency surgery. Every doctor in the hospital wanted me resting, My body still hurt every time I moved. Walking across the room felt like climbing a mountain. Yet somehow I was supposed to sit quietly while my husband sold my family's future. The answer became obvious. I couldn't. Around noon, Dr. Harrison entered my room for a routine examination. He seemed pleased with my recovery progress until I asked a simple question: how soon can I leave? His smile disappeared immediately. He explained that my condition remained stable but fragile. The infection risk had not completely passed. My stitches required monitoring. My mobility remained limited. In his professional opinion, leaving early would be irresponsible. Under normal circumstances, I respected medical advice. This wasn't a normal circumstance. I thanked him for his concern and waited until he left. Then I started planning. The first step involved information. I called Renee and forwarded every document connected to the investor meeting. 20 minutes later, she called back, sounding far more concerned than before. Several names on the attendee list carried enormous influence in commercial real estate circles. If the meeting proceeded without interruption, Darnell might successfully convince people that he possessed legitimate authority. Even if the sale ultimately collapsed, untangling the legal damage could take months, time I didn't have. After ending the call, I opened my laptop and began reviewing every document connected to the trust. My grandfather had always been meticulous. Years earlier, he often joked that paperwork protected families better than promises ever could. At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. Now I understood exactly what he meant. Hidden deep within the trust provisions were multiple safeguards designed to prevent unauthorized asset transfers. Several required direct beneficiary confirmation. Others triggered automatic review procedures. The protections were strong. Unfortunately, they only worked if someone activated them before the transaction progressed too far. The more I researched, the clearer the situation became. I needed access to physical records stored at home, original trust documents, property agreements, legacy amendments, materials that could immediately expose Darnell's fraud. Unfortunately, those documents sat nearly 20 miles away, while I remained trapped inside a hospital bed. By evening, frustration had evolved into determination. Monique arrived carrying dinner and immediately noticed the change in my expression. "You're planning something," she said. I didn't deny it. Instead, I explained everything: the meeting, the timeline, the legal risks, the need to reach the documents before Darnell's people moved any further. Monique listened quietly before delivering exactly the response I expected. "Absolutely not." She reminded me that I could barely walk without assistance. She reminded me that my stitches were fresh. She reminded me that emergency surgery patients weren't supposed to sneak out of hospitals. Every argument she made was reasonable. Every argument she made was correct. None of them changed my mind. Around midnight, after Monique finally left, I made my decision. The following morning, I requested another update from the nursing staff. During the conversation, I learned something interesting. Shift changes created a brief period of reduced activity in my section of the recovery floor. Nurses moved between assignments. Administrative staff rotated responsibilities. Security focused primarily on incoming visitors. The information wasn't important to most patients. To me, it sounded like opportunity. The next day passed painfully slowly. Every hour felt wasted. Every minute brought the investor meeting closer. Late that afternoon, another billing discussion took place regarding my insurance complications. The hospital remained committed to treatment, but administrative concerns continued multiplying. Listening to them only reinforced my decision. Darnell hadn't accidentally damaged my life. He had systematically attacked every source of stability he could reach. My marriage, my finances, my healthcare, my inheritance. Waiting politely for justice suddenly felt ridiculous. Shortly after 7 that evening, the floor entered its usual transition period. Staff members moved between stations. New personnel arrived. Others departed. Exactly as I hoped, attention became fragmented. My heart pounded as I slowly removed monitoring leads from my arms. Every movement hurt. Every motion reminded me that I had undergone surgery only days earlier. For a moment, fear almost convinced me to stop. Then I pictured Darnell sitting in Chicago discussing the sale of my grandfather's building. The fear disappeared. Carefully, I changed into loose clothing Monique had brought earlier. Standing upright nearly doubled me over in pain. I waited for the dizziness to pass before taking another step, then another, then another. The hallway felt impossibly long. Every nurse station looked dangerous. Every approaching footstep triggered panic. Yet somehow, nobody stopped me. Nobody questioned me. 10 minutes later, I entered an elevator heading toward the parking structure. My pulse hammered so loudly that I could hear it. When the doors finally opened, cool evening air hit my face for the first time since surgery. The sensation felt surreal. I was exhausted, sore, terrified, and completely committed. Outside the hospital entrance, I ordered a rideshare and leaned against a concrete pillar while waiting. The driver arrived 7 minutes later. As I climbed carefully into the back seat, he glanced at my hospital wristband and frowned. "You okay?" he asked. I looked back toward the building shrinking behind us and gave the only honest answer I could. "Not even close." Then I pulled out my phone, opened the location records connected to Darnell's accounts, and watched a familiar address appear on the screen. Home. Whatever happened next, I was finally done watching my life fall apart from a hospital bed. The ride away from the hospital felt unreal. Every bump in the road sent sharp pain through my abdomen, reminding me exactly how reckless my decision was. Part of me knew I should have been resting under medical supervision. Another part of me knew that by the time I recovered properly, Darnell could already be $5 million richer. That second voice was the one I chose to listen to. The city lights blurred outside the window as I leaned back against the seat and focused on breathing through the pain. My driver glanced at me several times through the rearview mirror but wisely avoided asking questions. I probably looked terrible, pale, exhausted, angry, a woman held together more by determination than physical strength. During the drive, I continued reviewing every document connected to the investor meeting. The more I studied the attendee list, the more disturbing the situation became. These weren't amateur scammers chasing quick money. Several investors controlled significant real estate portfolios across multiple states. The law firms attached to the transaction represented serious clients. Even the financing institutions involved carried national reputations. Darnell wasn't pitching a fantasy. He had somehow convinced experienced professionals that he possessed legitimate authority over an asset worth more than $5 million. That realization frightened me more than anything else. Lies can fool individuals. Fooling entire teams of attorneys, lenders, and investors requires preparation. It requires documentation. It requires confidence. Most importantly, it requires time. The longer I examined the evidence, the more obvious it became that this operation had started months before my surgery. By the time the rideshare reached downtown, my phone buzzed with another notification. This one came from social media. Normally, I ignored most updates. Tonight, curiosity got the better of me. The account belonged to Shanice. Her profile had always been public. The newest post appeared less than 20 minutes earlier. The photograph showed a crystal chandelier hanging above a private dining room. Champagne bottles rested on a polished table surrounded by expensive suits and designer dresses. At first, the image seemed harmless. Then I noticed Darnell standing in the background. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't behaving like a man who had abandoned his wife during a medical emergency. He looked proud, confident, victorious. The caption beneath the image made my stomach twist. Celebrating new beginnings with the right people. New beginnings. I almost laughed. It was amazing how often selfish people disguised greed as personal growth. I opened the next photograph. This one showed Shanice leaning against Darnell while both smiled directly into the camera. Several investors stood nearby, raising champagne glasses. Another image followed, then another. Each one revealed more details: name cards, company logos, meeting materials. The dinner wasn't a celebration after all. It was a networking event connected directly to the acquisition. They weren't simply enjoying themselves. They were selling my future. My hands tightened around the phone. Then I saw something that changed everything. In the corner of one photograph sat a leather presentation folder. Most people would have ignored it. I zoomed in. The image quality wasn't perfect, but it was good enough. Printed across the cover were 4 words: Peachtree Commercial Building Acquisition. My heart started pounding. The presentation had already been prepared. Marketing materials existed. Transaction packages existed. Investors were being briefed. This wasn't a preliminary discussion anymore. They had moved far beyond exploration. They were actively building momentum toward a sale. Suddenly, another detail caught my attention. A familiar face stood near the far end of the table. For several seconds, I couldn't place him. Then recognition hit. Marcus Hill, one of the regional brokers who previously approached our family about purchasing the building years earlier. My grandfather rejected his offer personally. Marcus knew exactly who owned the property. He knew exactly who managed the trust, which meant one of two things had happened. Either Darnell had somehow convinced him that ownership changed hands, or Marcus was willingly ignoring obvious warning signs in pursuit of a commission. Neither possibility made me feel better. I immediately forwarded every screenshot to Renee. Her response arrived less than 5 minutes later. "This is getting dangerous." Those 4 words carried more weight than she probably intended. Because I knew what she meant. Once enough money enters a transaction, people become invested in believing the deal is real. Investors spend money. Attorneys bill hours. Brokers promise commissions. Expectations grow. If I disrupted the process now, I wouldn't just be challenging Darnell. I would be challenging everyone standing to profit from his lies. The rideshare finally reached my neighborhood. As we approached the house, another notification appeared. This time it wasn't a photograph. It was a short video clip uploaded by one of the guests attending the dinner. I pressed play. Music echoed through a luxurious private room. Glasses clinked. People laughed. Then the camera briefly focused on Darnell. Someone asked him how he planned to celebrate after closing the deal. His answer made my blood run cold. "After Friday," he said with a grin, "everything changes forever." The guests laughed and raised their glasses. Shanice kissed his cheek. The video ended. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen. Everything changes forever. He wasn't talking about a business transaction. He was talking about my life, my inheritance, my future, the future my grandfather spent decades building. And he was celebrating it while I still carried fresh surgical stitches across my stomach. The anger that rose inside me felt different from anything I had experienced before. It wasn't heartbreak anymore. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't even betrayal. It was clarity. Complete and absolute clarity. Darnell wasn't confused. He wasn't struggling. He wasn't making mistakes. He knew exactly what he was doing. And for the first time since waking up in that hospital bed, I stopped wondering whether my marriage could be saved. Because the man appearing in those photographs wasn't my husband anymore. He was my opponent. The rideshare slowed to a stop near my street. As I stepped carefully onto the sidewalk, pain shot through my body again. I ignored it. My eyes were already fixed on the house waiting at the end of the block. The place I still believed was my home. I had no idea what I was about to find inside. But one thing was certain. The real war was finally about to begin. By the time I reached the front gate, the last traces of hope were gone. Somewhere during the ride home, a small, irrational part of me had continued searching for an explanation that would make everything less terrible. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. Maybe the photographs were misleading. Maybe Darnell was having some kind of breakdown. Standing on the sidewalk in front of my own house, I finally accepted the truth. None of those explanations existed. The house looked normal from the outside. The porch lights glowed softly against the evening sky. The flower beds I planted during spring still lined the walkway. My car still sat in the driveway exactly where I left it before the emergency surgery. To a stranger, everything would have appeared perfectly ordinary. Then I walked toward the front door and inserted my key. Nothing happened. I frowned and tried again. The key entered the lock but refused to turn. A cold feeling spread through my chest. Slowly, I removed the key and stared at it. Then I tried the secondary lock. Same result. Darnell had changed the locks. For several seconds, I simply stood there looking at the door. The physical pain from surgery suddenly felt insignificant compared to what I was experiencing now. I wasn't being locked out by a criminal. I wasn't being locked out by a stranger. I was being locked out by my husband, a man whose name appeared beside mine on the mortgage, a man who once promised we would grow old together inside this house. My first instinct was to start pounding on the door. My second instinct was much more useful. Several years earlier, after a neighborhood burglary, I had hidden an emergency key inside a weatherproof lockbox attached beneath the rear deck. Darnell knew about the box. What he didn't know was that I secretly changed the access code after catching our teenage nephew using it without permission. The realization gave me exactly what I needed: an advantage. Moving slowly to avoid aggravating my stitches, I circled toward the backyard. Every step hurt. Every movement reminded me that I should have been recovering in a hospital bed. Yet the closer I got to the deck, the more determined I became. Within minutes, I located the lockbox exactly where I left it. My hands trembled slightly as I entered the code. The latch clicked open. Inside sat the spare key. For the first time all day, I smiled. Not because I felt victorious, because Darnell had overlooked something. The man who spent months planning my destruction still believed he knew everything about me. He didn't. The back door opened quietly. The moment I stepped inside, I knew someone had been living in my house. The smell was different. The furniture arrangement was different. Decorative pieces I carefully selected over the years had disappeared. Several family photographs were gone from the hallway. Others had been replaced entirely. Confusion quickly turned into anger. This wasn't simply abandonment anymore. Someone was actively rewriting my life. I moved deeper into the house. The living room looked cleaner than usual, but not in a comforting way. It felt staged, artificial, as though someone had attempted to erase evidence that I ever existed there. Then I heard laughter upstairs. Female laughter. My pulse exploded. Every instinct screamed at me to leave immediately. Instead, I moved toward the staircase. Halfway up, I heard a familiar voice. Shanice. There was no doubt. I recognized her laugh instantly. Carefully, I continued climbing. The closer I got, the more conversation became audible. Then I heard words that stopped me cold. Honestly, the place feels better without her stuff everywhere. More laughter followed. My vision blurred with rage. I reached the second-floor landing and slowly looked toward the master bedroom. The door stood partially open. Inside, Shanice was standing in front of my mirror wearing one of my silk robes. My robe. The one I purchased during our anniversary trip to Napa Valley. For several seconds, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Then reality arrived all at once. She wasn't visiting. She wasn't helping Darnell pack. She wasn't staying temporarily. Shanice had moved into my life. Several expensive shopping bags sat on the bed. My jewelry box rested open beside them. Drawers had been emptied. Closets reorganized. Personal belongings sorted into piles. The woman standing in my bedroom wasn't acting like a guest. She was acting like an owner. A second woman stood nearby, helping fold clothes. Neither noticed me at first. They were too busy laughing. Too busy discussing which items should stay and which should be donated. Donated. I nearly laughed at the absurdity. They were deciding the fate of my possessions while I still carried stitches from emergency surgery. Finally, Shanice looked up. The expression on her face changed instantly. Shock flashed across her features. Then something else appeared. Not guilt. Not embarrassment. Irritation. As though my presence had interrupted her evening. "What are you doing here?" she asked. The question was so outrageous that I almost thought I misunderstood it. What was I doing here? In my house, in my bedroom, looking at my belongings. The audacity left me speechless. Shanice recovered quickly. Within seconds, confidence returned. She crossed her arms and looked me up and down. Her gaze lingered briefly on my hospital wristband. Then she smiled. The smile wasn't friendly. It wasn't nervous. It was cruel. "Darnell said you might do something dramatic," she said. "He told me the medication could make you unstable." I stared at her in disbelief. Unstable. Even now, they were building a narrative, preparing explanations, creating excuses. Every detail had been planned. Shanice took another step forward. "You really shouldn't be here, Charmaine." The casual way she said my name made my skin crawl. Then she glanced toward my suitcase sitting near the doorway. "Most of your things are already being sorted. Darnell thought it would make the transition easier." Transition. There it was, the word that revealed everything. They hadn't just stolen money. They hadn't just stolen opportunities. They had already divided my life like inheritance after a funeral. In their minds, I was gone, replaced, finished. For one terrifying moment, I understood exactly how vulnerable I truly was. I was exhausted, injured, alone. and standing inside a house full of people who wanted me erased. Then my phone vibrated. I looked down and saw a name appear on the screen. Mama Gloria, Darnell's mother. As Shanice continued talking, completely unaware of who was calling, a realization slowly formed inside my mind. Maybe I wasn't as alone as they thought. And maybe the biggest mistake Darnell made wasn't stealing my money or forging my signature. Maybe his biggest mistake was believing his own mother would choose him over the truth. For several seconds after seeing Mama Gloria's name on my phone screen, I didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to, because I suddenly realized how dangerous the situation had become. Shanice was standing inside my bedroom wearing my robe. My belongings were being sorted like I was already dead. Darnell had apparently convinced people that I was unstable, irrational, and incapable of managing my own affairs. Every new discovery made the picture clearer. This wasn't an affair that spiraled out of control. This was a coordinated takeover. The moment Shanice noticed the caller ID, her confidence flickered for the first time. Only briefly, but long enough for me to see it. Then she recovered and folded her arms. "You should probably answer that," she said casually. "Darnell's mother has been very worried about your behavior." The way she emphasized the word behavior told me exactly what story they had been spreading. I accepted the call without taking my eyes off her. Before I could speak, Mama Gloria's voice exploded through the speaker. "Charmaine, where are you?" The urgency immediately caught my attention. I stepped away from the doorway and lowered my voice. "I'm at the house." Silence followed. Then came a single question. "Is Shanice there?" I glanced toward the bedroom. Shanice was pretending not to listen while listening to every word. "Yes." Another pause. This one felt heavier, more deliberate. Finally, Mama Gloria spoke again. "Do not leave. Do not sign anything. Do not let anyone convince you to leave that house." The seriousness in her voice instantly raised my pulse. Before I could ask questions, she continued, "I'm still gathering information. Just stay where you are." Then the call ended. No explanations, no details, nothing. The entire conversation lasted less than a minute, yet it changed the atmosphere completely. Shanice noticed it too. The moment I returned my attention to her, something had shifted. She wasn't dealing with a broken wife anymore. She was dealing with someone who knew she was being lied to. The smile slowly disappeared from her face. "You know," she said, "this would be easier if you stopped fighting reality." I almost laughed. Reality, coming from the woman standing in another woman's bedroom wearing another woman's clothes. "Reality?" I asked. "Reality is that you're trespassing in my house." Shanice rolled her eyes. The gesture revealed more about her than any confession ever could. She genuinely believed she had won. "Your house?" she repeated. "That's not what Darnell says." Then she walked toward the dresser and casually picked up one of my diamond bracelets. My grandmother gave me that bracelet years earlier. I watched Shanice turn it over in her hands before dropping it into one of the shopping bags. The deliberate disrespect made my stomach twist. She wasn't stealing anymore. She was performing. Every action carried a message. Every movement was designed to humiliate me. "Put that down," I said. Shanice smirked. "Or what?" The challenge hung in the air between us. For a moment, neither woman moved. Then her friend stepped forward nervously. Unlike Shanice, she suddenly looked uncomfortable. Smart people usually become uncomfortable when criminal behavior starts feeling real. Shanice ignored her completely. "You should be thanking me," she continued. "If Darnell stayed with you, he'd spend the rest of his life miserable." There it was. The justification. Every selfish person eventually creates one. They don't see themselves as villains. They see themselves as heroes, rescuing happiness from people who don't deserve it. "You think this is about love?" I asked quietly. Shanice laughed. "No. I think this is about choices. Darnell chose me." The arrogance was breathtaking. Yet the more she talked, the more information she revealed. Over the next several minutes, she couldn't stop herself. People like Shanice rarely do. Winning makes them careless. She mentioned the Chicago apartment. She mentioned investor dinners. She mentioned future travel plans. Then she made one critical mistake. She mentioned the building, not by name, not directly, but enough. "After Friday," she said, "none of this will matter anyway." My heart skipped. Friday. The investor meeting. The sale. She knew. Maybe not every detail, but enough to understand money was coming. Significant money. The realization confirmed everything. Shanice wasn't simply sleeping with Darnell. She was part of the operation. She expected to profit from it. Suddenly her behavior made perfect sense. The expensive bags, the confidence, the entitlement. She wasn't acting like a mistress, she was acting like someone expecting a payout. Then something unexpected happened. Her friend spoke up. Maybe we should wait until everything's finalized. The room instantly became quiet. Shanice shot her a warning look. Too late. I noticed. More importantly, Shanice noticed that I noticed. Finalized? I repeated. Neither woman answered, but they didn't need to. The damage was already done. The expression crossing Shanice's face revealed everything. Fear. Tiny. Brief. Yet unmistakable. For the first time all evening, she looked uncertain. Not because she felt guilty, because she realized she might have said too much. I took a slow step forward. What exactly is being finalized? Silence. Another step. What did Darnell tell you about the building? Still nothing. Then Shanice's confidence returned in a flash of anger. You're not getting anything, she snapped. Do you understand? Nothing. He chose me. He chose our future. The words echoed through the room. Our future, not their relationship, not their happiness. Their future. Translation. The money, the building, the assets. Everything suddenly connected. Before I could respond, another sound interrupted us. A loud knock downstairs. All three of us froze. Then another knock followed. Heavier this time. More deliberate. Shanice looked confused. Her friend looked terrified. I slowly turned toward the hallway. Whoever stood at the front door wasn't expected. The third knock rattled through the house. Then my phone vibrated again. A text message from Mama Gloria appeared on the screen. 3 simple words. We're outside now. For a moment, nobody moved. The house that had been filled with arrogance only seconds earlier suddenly felt different. The confidence radiating from Shanice disappeared so fast it was almost comical. Her eyes darted toward the hallway, then toward the staircase, then back to me. The woman who had been mocking me moments ago now looked like someone trying to calculate risk. The third knock echoed through the house again. Hard, deliberate, unmistakable. Whoever stood outside wasn't leaving. Shanice swallowed visibly. Who's here? She asked. I looked down at the message from Mama Gloria and felt something I hadn't experienced since waking up in that hospital bed. Relief, genuine relief. Not because my problems were solved, not because Darnell's plan had collapsed, but because for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't standing alone. Without answering Shanice's question, I turned and started walking toward the stairs. Pain shot through my abdomen with every step, but I ignored it. Behind me, Shanice called my name. Then she called it again. I kept walking. By the time I reached the front hallway, another knock rattled the door. This one was followed by a familiar voice. Open the door, Shanice. Mama Gloria. The silence that followed was almost beautiful. For years, Darnell's mother had been the one person nobody argued with. She didn't raise her voice often. She didn't need to. When Mama Gloria spoke, people listened. The problem for Darnell was that he spent so much time believing his mother would automatically support him that he never considered what would happen if she didn't. I unlocked the door and opened it. Mama Gloria stood on the porch wearing a dark coat and the expression of a woman who had completely run out of patience. Beside her stood Uncle Jerome, 6'3", former military, retired contractor, and one of the few men Darnell genuinely feared. The moment Uncle Jerome stepped inside, the atmosphere changed. Shanice appeared at the top of the staircase and froze. Her confidence vanished entirely. Mrs. Gloria, she began. Mama Gloria raised one hand. Shanice immediately stopped talking. Not one word, Mama Gloria said. Her voice remained calm. Somehow that made it more terrifying. For several seconds, she simply looked around the house. The missing photographs, the rearranged furniture, the shopping bags, the open jewelry boxes. The evidence was everywhere. Finally, her gaze settled on Shanice. You moved into another woman's home while she was recovering from surgery? Shanice opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. Darnell told me. I don't care what Darnell told you. The interruption landed like a hammer. Nobody spoke. Mama Gloria slowly walked into the living room and continued surveying the damage. Then she looked at me. For the first time that evening, her expression softened. "Are you all right?" I almost laughed. The honest answer was no. My marriage had exploded. My finances were under attack. Someone was trying to steal my inheritance. I had escaped a hospital less than 24 hours earlier. Nothing about my life was all right. Yet somehow, hearing her ask made it easier to breathe. "Not really," I admitted. She nodded. I figured. Then her attention returned to Shanice. What happened next surprised me. Mama Gloria didn't scream. She didn't insult her. She didn't threaten her. Instead, she asked questions. Careful questions. Precise questions. Questions designed to expose lies. When did you move in? How long have you known about the Chicago meetings? Who paid for the apartment? Which accounts funded the travel? Every answer Shanice gave only created new problems. By the 10th minute, even she realized it. Small inconsistencies started appearing. Timelines didn't match. Explanations contradicted earlier statements. Uncle Jerome remained silent throughout the entire conversation. He simply stood near the doorway watching. The effect was remarkable. Shanice became more nervous every minute. Finally, Mama Gloria asked the question that changed everything. "Did Darnell tell you the building belongs to him?" Shanice hesitated. A tiny hesitation, barely noticeable. Yet it was enough. Mama Gloria saw it immediately. So did I. "Answer the question," Mama Gloria said. Shanice looked away. That was answer enough. Mama Gloria slowly closed her eyes. For a brief moment, genuine disappointment crossed her face. Not disappointment in me. Not disappointment in Shanice. Disappointment in her son. "Lord help that boy," she whispered. Then she turned toward me. "Charmaine, there's something you need to know." My pulse quickened instantly. Mama Gloria sat down at the dining room table and motioned for me to join her. Uncle Jerome remained standing. Shanice remained frozen near the staircase. The entire house felt suspended in time. Then Mama Gloria began explaining what she had discovered over the previous 48 hours. Darnell hadn't just borrowed money. He hadn't just moved assets. He was drowning in debt. Massive debt. 6 months earlier, several speculative investments collapsed. Instead of accepting the losses, he borrowed more money attempting to recover them. Then he borrowed again. And again. The deeper he fell, the more desperate he became. By the time I entered the hospital, he was trapped. The $80,000 from our accounts wasn't enough. The insurance changes weren't enough. Even the Chicago investors weren't enough. He needed the building. Not because he wanted a new life. Because he was running from financial ruin. The revelation hit me harder than I expected. Suddenly, every strange decision made sense. The secrecy, the forged signatures, the urgency, the timing. This wasn't a man chasing happiness. It was a man trying to escape collapse. Mama Gloria continued speaking. Several family members already knew pieces of the story. None knew the entire truth. Darnell had lied to everyone. Different versions for different people. Different excuses. Different explanations. He spent months constructing a web of deception so complicated that eventually even he couldn't keep track of it. Then, Uncle Jerome finally spoke for the first time all evening. "The problem is," he said quietly, "he's not the only one involved anymore." Every person in the room looked toward him. Uncle Jerome reached into his coat pocket and removed a folder. Then he placed it on the table in front of me. The thickness alone made my stomach tighten. "I spent today talking to people," he said. "Lawyers, brokers, investors." He tapped the folder once. "And what I found is a lot bigger than an affair." Slowly, I opened it. Inside sat copies of emails, transaction records, meeting schedules, and financial summaries, more evidence than I could process in a single glance. Then I saw one name appear repeatedly across multiple documents: Marcus Hill, the broker from the investor dinner. Beside his name sat several others. People with money, influence, connections. People who stood to profit if the building changed hands. My heart began pounding. Because for the first time I understood the real scale of what we were facing. This wasn't Darnell and Shanice anymore. This was an entire network of people betting that nobody would stop them before Friday. And as I stared at the mountain of evidence spread across my dining room table, I realized something else. We now had less than 48 hours to prove them wrong. The house remained quiet long after Mama Gloria and Uncle Jerome finished explaining what they had uncovered. Evidence covered nearly every surface in the dining room: emails, property reports, financial statements, meeting schedules. Every page revealed another layer of deception. The deeper we looked, the more obvious it became that Darnell's situation was far worse than anyone imagined. He wasn't chasing wealth. He wasn't chasing freedom. He was running from disaster. Yet despite everything we discovered, one question still bothered me. If Darnell was truly desperate, why hadn't he contacted me directly? Why hide behind lawyers, forged signatures, and manipulated documents? The answer arrived less than 20 minutes later. My phone rang. The screen displayed his name. For a moment, nobody spoke. Mama Gloria looked at the phone. Uncle Jerome looked at the phone. Even Shanice, standing silently near the opposite side of the room, looked at the phone. The timing wasn't a coincidence. Somehow Darnell knew something had changed. I answered on speaker. The voice that greeted me sounded calm. Too calm. Charmaine. Hearing him say my name sent a wave of anger through my chest, not because I missed him, because he sounded completely unaffected by the destruction he caused. "Where are you?" I asked. A brief pause followed. "Chicago." Of course. Then came the performance. Concern filled his voice. Artificial concern. Carefully manufactured concern. He asked about my recovery. Asked how I was feeling. Asked whether I was resting. The same man who abandoned me after emergency surgery suddenly wanted to play the role of caring husband. Nobody in the room said a word. We simply listened. Finally, Darnell reached the real reason for the call. "I've been hearing some things," he said cautiously. "People are worried about you." I almost laughed. There it was. The narrative. The story they had been building for weeks. "Worried about me?" I repeated. "Yes. You've been under a lot of stress. The surgery, the medications, everything happening lately." Every sentence felt rehearsed. Every phrase sounded prepared. Darnell wasn't calling to check on me. He was laying a foundation, a legal foundation, one designed to paint me as unstable if I interfered with his plans. Mama Gloria's expression darkened immediately. Uncle Jerome simply shook his head. Darnell continued speaking. "I heard you left the hospital early." Another pause. That wasn't a good decision. The arrogance nearly took my breath away. The man stealing my inheritance was criticizing my medical decisions. "You emptied our accounts," I said. Silence followed. Then Darnell sighed dramatically. "That's not what happened." Another lie. Smooth, immediate, effortless. He explained that temporary transfers were necessary, that business opportunities required flexibility, that I didn't understand the full situation. Every excuse sounded more ridiculous than the last. Yet what interested me wasn't the lies. It was how quickly he told them. Experienced liars don't invent stories in the moment. They repeat stories they've already practiced. Then Darnell made a mistake. A small one. The kind people make when they believe they're smarter than everyone else. While explaining the investor meeting, he casually referenced documentation that should have been confidential. My eyes immediately moved toward Uncle Jerome. He noticed it too. The document Darnell mentioned had only been distributed to a limited group of participants, which meant he wasn't merely involved. He was personally directing portions of the transaction. More importantly, he had access to materials he previously claimed not to understand. The contradiction was impossible to miss. The conversation continued for nearly 15 minutes. Throughout the entire call, Darnell attempted the same strategy repeatedly. Convince me I was confused. Convince me I was emotional. Convince me I lacked information. The problem was that every attempt revealed more about him than it did about me. Then came the most revealing moment of all. "You need to stop listening to people who are trying to turn you against me," he said. My gaze shifted toward Mama Gloria. Slowly, I smiled. "People like who?" Another pause. Longer this time. Then Darnell answered. "My mother." The room went completely silent. Even Shanice looked shocked. Darnell didn't know his mother was standing less than 10 feet away. He didn't know she could hear every word. He didn't know that years of automatic loyalty had finally reached their limit. Mama Gloria closed her eyes. not in anger, in disappointment, deep, painful disappointment, the kind only a parent can feel. Darnell kept talking, completely unaware of the damage he was causing. He accused family members of misunderstanding him. He blamed outsiders. He blamed circumstances. He blamed pressure. Everyone except himself. Finally, he reached the end of his performance. "Charmaine, trust me." The sentence hung in the air. "Trust me. After 13 years, after the affair, after the forged signatures, after the stolen money, after the hospital, trust me." I almost admired the audacity. Then I decided to give him something he didn't expect. I pretended to surrender. My voice softened. My resistance disappeared. I told him I was exhausted, confused, overwhelmed. I told him maybe we should talk in person. The effect was immediate. Confidence flooded back into his voice. For the first time during the entire conversation, he sounded relaxed, victorious. He believed I was breaking. He believed the manipulation was working. Most importantly, he started talking more freely, much more freely. By the end of the call, he had unknowingly confirmed meeting times, participant names, travel schedules, and several details about the Chicago negotiations. When he finally hung up, the room remained silent for several seconds. Then Uncle Jerome smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man watching someone dig their own grave. "He just gave us half the case," he said. Mama Gloria nodded slowly. "And he still thinks he's winning." Then Uncle Jerome opened one of the folders and pointed toward a series of emails connected to the investor dinner. For the first time that night, I noticed something strange. One attendee wasn't an investor. He wasn't a broker either. In fact, he wasn't listed anywhere in the transaction structure at all. Yet his name appeared repeatedly throughout the communications. The moment Uncle Jerome explained who the man really was, every hair on my arms stood up. Because the mysterious guest wasn't there to buy property. He was there to investigate fraud. And suddenly Friday's meeting looked very different than Darnell imagined. For several seconds after Uncle Jerome revealed the identity of the mysterious attendee, nobody spoke. The realization settled slowly across the room like a storm cloud moving over the horizon. Darnell believed he was walking into the most important business meeting of his life. He thought investors were preparing to make him wealthy. He thought lawyers were helping him secure a future with Shanice. What he didn't know was that at least one person scheduled to attend wasn't there to celebrate a transaction. He was there because someone had started asking questions. Serious questions. Questions involving forged documents, unauthorized asset transfers, and potential fraud. Unfortunately, that information alone wasn't enough to stop the deal. Suspicion isn't evidence. Concern isn't proof. We still needed something concrete, something undeniable, something capable of destroying the story Darnell spent months constructing. Mama Gloria seemed to understand that better than anyone. The moment Uncle Jerome finished speaking, she stood up and took control of the room. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't give a speech. She simply became the person everyone instinctively followed. "We're done reacting," she said. "Now we're planning." The shift in energy was immediate. For the first time since arriving home, I felt like we were moving forward instead of chasing damage. Over the next several hours, every document inside the house was reviewed. Every email was cross-referenced. Every timeline was rebuilt from the ground up. Mama Gloria approached the situation the same way she approached every major problem throughout her life. Methodically, patiently, ruthlessly. Around midnight, she uncovered something none of us expected. Buried inside a collection of financial correspondence sat evidence that several investors had been given completely different explanations regarding ownership of the Peachtree commercial building. One group was told Darnell possessed management authority. Another was told he represented a family partnership. A third was told he was acting under direct beneficiary approval. 3 separate stories. 3 separate versions of reality. None completely true. The discovery immediately changed everything. Fraud becomes much harder to defend when the lies stop matching each other. Uncle Jerome smiled the moment he saw it. "He got greedy," he said quietly. "That's when people get sloppy. The deeper we dug, the more sloppiness we found." Multiple email chains contained conflicting dates. Several authorization forms referenced documents that didn't exist. one investor received property income figures that differed significantly from figures sent to another investor. Individually, the mistakes seemed minor. Together, they formed a pattern. Darnell wasn't managing a professional transaction. He was desperately improvising. Then came the biggest discovery of the night. Shortly after 1 in the morning, Mama Gloria located an archived trust amendment most of us had forgotten existed. The document dated back nearly 12 years, long before my marriage, long before Darnell entered the picture, long before anyone imagined a situation like this. The amendment had been added personally by my grandfather after a bitter legal dispute involving a distant relative. At the time, everyone considered it excessive. Now it looked brilliant. The clause stated that any attempt to transfer, liquidate, or negotiate the sale of trust-controlled assets through fraudulent authority would automatically trigger emergency review procedures and expose all involved parties to personal liability. Not just the person committing the fraud, everyone knowingly participating in it: investors, brokers, advisors, anyone who continued moving forward after receiving notice. My heart nearly stopped. "You're telling me the entire deal can collapse?" I asked. Mama Gloria shook her head. "I'm telling you the right people are about to run for their lives." Suddenly, the entire strategy changed. We no longer needed to convince everyone that Darnell was lying. We only needed to put the truth directly in front of them. Once investors realized their own money could be exposed to legal risk, self-preservation would do the rest. For the first time all evening, genuine hope entered the room. Unfortunately, hope came with a deadline. Friday was approaching fast. The investor dinner remained scheduled. Travel arrangements were already finalized. Darnell still believed everything was proceeding exactly as planned, which meant we had one opportunity to confront him before contracts moved any further. Around 2 in the morning, exhaustion finally started catching up with me. The surgery, the stress, the lack of sleep, every part of my body hurt. Mama Gloria noticed immediately. Without saying a word, she placed a blanket around my shoulders and handed me a cup of tea. The gesture nearly broke me. Not because of the tea, because throughout this entire nightmare, she had every reason to protect her son. Instead, she chose the truth. The realization reminded me that family isn't defined by blood alone. It's defined by character. Meanwhile, several states away, Darnell remained completely unaware of the storm gathering around him. New photographs continued appearing online. More dinners, more champagne, more smiling investors. Every image showed the same thing: confidence. Total confidence. Looking at those photographs now felt almost surreal. He genuinely believed he was winning. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted everyone. The next morning, Uncle Jerome received a call from one of his contacts inside the real estate community. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. When he ended the call, his expression had changed. "What is it?" I asked. He slowly looked around the room before answering. "The meeting isn't just a dinner anymore." Silence followed. Then he continued. "Final documents are being prepared." My stomach tightened immediately. Final documents. The words carried enormous weight. It meant the timeline was accelerating. It meant people expected signatures. It meant the transaction was closer to completion than we originally thought. Mama Gloria nodded once. "No panic. No hesitation. Just certainty. Then we're going to Chicago." For a moment, nobody spoke. The decision felt inevitable the second she said it. Every road had been leading toward this moment from the beginning. The hospital, the missing money, the forged signatures, the affair, the building. Everything pointed toward one room, one table, one final confrontation. And as I looked down at the mountain of evidence spread across my dining room table, I realized something else. By the time Darnell saw me again, I wouldn't be arriving as the wife he abandoned. I'd be arriving as the person holding the power to destroy everything he thought he had won. The flight to Chicago felt much shorter than it should have. Maybe because none of us spent much time talking. Maybe because every person on that plane understood what was waiting for us at the other end. For nearly a week, my life had been moving faster than I could process. Emergency surgery, a missing husband, stolen money, forged signatures, a mistress living in my house, a $5 million property sale. At some point, shock stopped feeling like an emotion and became my new reality. I spent most of the flight reviewing documents while Mama Gloria quietly read through legal notes, and Uncle Jerome made phone calls to people whose names I didn't recognize. Every now and then, he would jot something down in a small notebook before making another call. Whatever network he had spent decades building was working harder than ever now. The closer we got to Chicago, the more serious he became. By the time the plane landed, his notebook contained 3 pages of names, numbers, and observations. We checked into a hotel less than 2 miles from Le Petit Chateau, the upscale restaurant where Darnell planned to finalize the deal. The location wasn't accidental. Everything had been carefully selected. The investors wanted privacy. The brokers wanted exclusivity. Darnell wanted luxury. What none of them wanted was surprise. Fortunately for us, surprise was exactly what we intended to deliver. The moment we arrived at the hotel, Uncle Jerome gathered us inside one of the conference rooms. Several folders already waited on the table. Additional evidence had arrived while we were traveling. More emails, more transaction records, more inconsistencies. Every hour seemed to reveal another crack in Darnell's story. One particular document immediately caught my attention. It contained communication between Marcus Hill and one of the financing groups involved in the acquisition. According to the email, several investors were becoming nervous. Questions had started appearing regarding authority verification. Some participants wanted additional assurances before moving forward. Others wanted updated legal opinions. That information mattered because fear spreads quickly among people risking millions of dollars. Once doubt enters the room, confidence becomes difficult to recover. For the first time since this nightmare began, I realized we weren't arriving in Chicago as underdogs. We were arriving at a table that was already starting to wobble. Later that afternoon, Mama Gloria and I met privately with Renee and 2 attorneys from a Chicago law firm. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. Most of the conversation focused on timing, when to speak, when to remain silent, which documents to reveal first, which documents to hold back. I quickly learned something important about experienced attorneys. They don't win because they know the law better than everyone else. They win because they understand when people are most vulnerable. Darnell expected confrontation. He expected accusations. What he didn't expect was patience. According to the lawyers, allowing him to continue talking would likely create more damage than interrupting him. The strategy felt risky, but it also felt smart. Every time Darnell opened his mouth, he seemed to create new problems for himself. By early evening, another piece of good news arrived. One of Uncle Jerome's contacts had managed to confirm the identity of several attendees. The mysterious investigator from the email chain would definitely be present. More importantly, he wasn't attending alone. 2 additional individuals connected to financial compliance reviews were also expected. The information immediately changed the mood inside the room. Nobody celebrated, nobody relaxed, but for the first time, optimism felt justified. Darnell still believed he was walking into a room full of allies. Reality looked very different. That night, sleep proved impossible. I sat alone near the hotel window, staring out at the Chicago skyline while replaying everything that had happened over the previous week. Part of me kept expecting to wake up and discover this was some terrible nightmare. Another part of me wondered how many lies Darnell told himself in order to justify what he had done. People rarely wake up and decide to become villains. They convince themselves they're victims. They create stories where betrayal becomes necessary and greed becomes survival. Somewhere along the way, Darnell stopped seeing me as his wife and started seeing me as an obstacle. The realization hurt more than I wanted to admit. Just before midnight, my phone vibrated. A new social media post appeared online. Shanice had uploaded another photograph. This one showed her standing inside a luxury suite overlooking the city. She wore a designer dress I recognized immediately because I had purchased it months earlier. The caption beneath the image read, "Big day tomorrow. Everything changes." I stared at the words for several seconds before closing the application. The arrogance no longer made me angry. It made me focused. Because tomorrow, everything really was going to change. Just not in the way she expected. The following morning arrived faster than anyone wanted. By noon, final preparations were underway. Lawyers reviewed documents one last time. Uncle Jerome continued receiving updates from his contacts. Mama Gloria remained remarkably calm. Watching her helped settle my nerves. Darnell spent his entire life believing his mother would always protect him. Today she was helping expose him. That fact alone said everything. Around 3 o'clock, we received confirmation that the investor dinner would proceed exactly as scheduled. Attendance remained strong. The brokers were confident. The financing representatives were arriving on time. Darnell had no idea anyone was coming for him. The confidence almost felt tragic. Almost. As evening approached, I stood in front of the mirror preparing for the confrontation. For the first time since leaving the hospital, I allowed myself to look beyond the fear, beyond the betrayal, beyond the chaos. What stared back at me wasn't the woman who woke up alone in a hospital bed. It wasn't the woman who discovered empty bank accounts or forged signatures. It was someone else. Someone stronger. Someone who had survived every attempt to break her. A knock sounded at the hotel room door. Uncle Jerome stepped inside. "It's time," he said quietly. My pulse immediately accelerated. The moment had finally arrived. Downstairs, vehicles waited to take us to Le Petit Chateau. Somewhere across the city, Darnell was probably adjusting his tie and preparing his victory speech. Somewhere across the city, Shanice was probably imagining what life would look like after $5 million changed hands. Neither of them understood that the story they planned to celebrate was about to become something very different. And as I stepped into the hallway beside Mama Gloria and Uncle Jerome, I realized that for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't traveling toward disaster. I was traveling toward the truth. Le Petit Chateau looked exactly like the kind of place Darnell always dreamed of belonging to. The restaurant occupied the top floor of a historic building overlooking downtown Chicago. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings. Soft piano music drifted through the air. Expensive suits and designer dresses moved between private dining rooms where fortunes were discussed over wine that cost more than most people's monthly rent. For years, Darnell chased rooms like this, rooms filled with people he believed mattered. Rooms where power and money sat together at the same table. Tonight, he finally thought he belonged among them. The irony was almost painful. Our vehicles stopped near the entrance shortly after 7 o'clock. Through the tinted window, I could already see guests arriving: investors, attorneys, brokers, financial representatives. Every person entering the building believed they were attending the closing stages of a profitable transaction. None of them realized they were walking into a disaster. Uncle Jerome checked his watch one final time. Mama Gloria remained calm as ever. The attorneys traveling with us reviewed their folders one last time before exiting the vehicle. No dramatic speeches were given. No inspirational words were necessary. Everyone already understood their role. We weren't arriving to create a scene. We were arriving to let the truth do what lies eventually fail to prevent. Inside the restaurant, a hostess escorted us toward a private event space located beyond the main dining area. The room itself was even more impressive than I expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. A long, polished table occupied the center of the room. Multiple presentation screens displayed financial projections and property images. Waiters moved between guests carrying champagne and appetizers. Everything had been arranged to celebrate success. Then I saw Darnell. He stood near the center of the room, speaking confidently to a group of investors. His posture radiated certainty. His smile radiated control. Looking at him from across the room, nobody would ever guess that he was drowning in debt and standing on top of a mountain of fraud. For a brief moment, I simply watched. The same man who ignored my calls after emergency surgery, the same man who emptied our accounts, the same man who forged my signature, the same man who moved another woman into my home before my hospital bracelet had even been removed. Yet there he stood, laughing comfortably while discussing my grandfather's building as though it belonged to him. Then Shanice appeared beside him. Her confidence matched his perfectly. The designer dress, the expensive jewelry, the satisfied smile. She looked exactly like someone preparing to spend money she hadn't earned. One of the investors said something that triggered laughter throughout the group. Darnell raised his glass in response. The scene felt almost surreal, because none of them knew the ending of the story they were celebrating. One by one, heads began turning toward our group as we entered the room. Recognition spread slowly at first, then rapidly. Several attendees recognized Mama Gloria. Others recognized Uncle Jerome. A few recognized the attorneys, But the reaction that mattered most came from Darnell. The moment his eyes found me, every trace of color disappeared from his face. The champagne glass froze halfway to his lips. For several seconds, he simply stared, not moving, not speaking, not breathing. The room continued buzzing around him while his entire world silently collapsed. Shanice noticed the change immediately and turned to follow his gaze. Her reaction wasn't much better. The smile vanished, the confidence vanished. For the first time since I met her, genuine fear appeared in her eyes. Neither of them expected me to be there. More importantly, neither of them expected me to arrive with witnesses. The silence gradually spread through the room. Conversations slowed, then stopped entirely. Investors looked confused. Attorneys exchanged glances. Waiters quietly disappeared toward the edges of the room. Every instinct in the space recognized that something significant was happening. Darnell recovered first. To his credit, he always adapted quickly. The problem was that quick adaptation often leads desperate people into bigger mistakes. He forced a smile and began walking toward us. "Charmaine," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "what are you doing here?" The question might have worked if everyone in the room hadn't just watched him react like a man seeing a ghost. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked around the room. The investors, the brokers, the attorneys, every person preparing to profit from this deal. Then I looked back at Darnell. "I came to attend the meeting involving my property." The sentence landed exactly the way I hoped it would. Confusion immediately spread among several attendees. Darnell's smile tightened. "Your property?" he repeated. "Charmaine, this isn't the place." There it was, the first attempt. Minimize, redirect, control. The same strategy manipulative people always use when reality becomes dangerous. Unfortunately for him, the room was already paying attention. One of the investors stepped forward, Marcus Hill, the broker who helped organize the transaction. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding," he said cautiously. I almost appreciated the effort. Almost. Before I could respond, Darnell jumped in. He explained that I was recovering from surgery. He explained that emotions had been running high. He explained that family matters sometimes created confusion. Every sentence sounded reasonable on the surface. That was what made him dangerous. Darnell rarely told lies that sounded ridiculous. He told lies that sounded plausible. Then he repeated them until people stopped asking questions. Several guests nodded politely. Others looked uncertain. Shanice stood quietly behind him, clearly hoping the situation would disappear. Then Mama Gloria spoke. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "There is no misunderstanding." The room immediately fell silent again. Darnell looked toward his mother and visibly stiffened. The expression on his face said everything. Until that moment, some part of him still believed she would protect him. Instead, she stepped forward and stood beside me. "Charmaine owns that building," she said calmly. "And my son knows it." The impact was immediate. Several investors exchanged concerned looks. Marcus Hill's expression changed. Two attorneys stopped taking notes and started listening more carefully. The energy inside the room shifted. Darnell felt it too. I could see it happening in real time. The confidence, the control, the certainty, all beginning to crack. Then one of the financing representatives asked a question that changed everything. "Mr. Ellis," he said carefully, "perhaps we should clarify the ownership structure before proceeding." Nobody in the room spoke after that. Because for the first time all evening, the deal wasn't moving forward anymore. It was standing still. And the longer it stood still, the more dangerous the truth became. The silence hanging over the room felt heavier than any argument ever could. Moments earlier, everyone had been preparing to celebrate a profitable acquisition. Now dozens of educated, experienced professionals were staring at one another, wondering whether they had just stepped into the middle of a fraud investigation. The transformation happened so quickly that even Darnell seemed unable to process it. One simple question regarding ownership had accomplished what months of lies could not prevent. It forced reality into the room. The financing representative who asked the question remained calm, but his expression had changed. He wasn't looking at Darnell like a business partner anymore. He was looking at him like a risk. That difference mattered. Investors can tolerate uncertainty. They can tolerate competition. What they cannot tolerate is exposure. And suddenly exposure was everywhere. Darnell cleared his throat and attempted to regain control. Of course, he said with a forced smile. I'd be happy to clarify. His voice sounded steady, but I knew him too well. Beneath that confidence, panic was beginning to grow. He launched into a polished explanation about family structures, management authority, trust relationships, and long-term planning. Listening to him felt almost surreal. If I hadn't lived through the last 13 years, I might have believed him myself. Every sentence sounded reasonable. Every explanation sounded professional. That was always Darnell's gift. He could make lies sound responsible. Unfortunately for him, tonight wasn't built on words. It was built on documents. The moment he finished speaking, one of the attorneys traveling with us calmly placed a folder on the conference table. Nobody interrupted. Nobody objected. The attorney simply opened the folder and slid several certified documents toward the investors. Then he stepped back. The room immediately became quiet again. One by one, attendees began reviewing the materials. Original trust records, beneficiary confirmations, ownership structures, management provisions. Every page told the same story. The building belonged to the trust belonged to me. Darnell possessed no ownership interest whatsoever. Not 5%, not 1%, nothing. The first visible crack appeared on Marcus Hill's face. He picked up one document, then another, then another. The confidence he carried earlier slowly disappeared. Across the room, two investors exchanged concerned looks. One attorney began flipping through notes much faster than before. The atmosphere continued shifting. Then Mama Gloria delivered the next blow. She calmly produced copies of several authorization forms submitted during the attempted transaction. At first glance, the signatures appeared legitimate. Then she handed the group a collection of verified originals, bank documents, tax filings, historical trust records. The difference became obvious almost immediately. Not to everyone, but to the people trained to recognize fraud. One investor removed his reading glasses and leaned closer. Another asked to compare the signatures side by side. The longer they looked, the worse things became for Darnell. "These don't match," someone finally said. The words landed like a gunshot. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. That single sentence carried enough weight on its own. Darnell immediately attempted damage control. He claimed administrative errors. He suggested clerical mistakes. He blamed third-party processors. The excuses came quickly. Too quickly. Every explanation only created more questions. Why were multiple versions of the same authorization circulating? Why did different investors receive different ownership descriptions? Why were several trust provisions omitted from presentation materials? Each question pushed him further into a corner. Meanwhile, Shanice remained completely silent. The woman who spent days celebrating online suddenly looked terrified. Her confidence had evaporated. Her future depended entirely on Darnell controlling the room, and for the first time all evening, he wasn't controlling anything. Then Uncle Jerome stood up. The movement alone attracted everyone's attention. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a broker. He wasn't an investor. He was something far more dangerous, a witness. Calmly, he explained how the family first discovered irregularities, the missing money, the altered insurance policies, the forged documentation, the timeline. Every piece fit together with uncomfortable precision. He never exaggerated, never speculated, never attacked. He simply presented facts. Facts are difficult to argue with, especially when they keep matching the evidence. By now, several attendees looked genuinely alarmed. The acquisition discussion had completely disappeared. Nobody cared about profit projections anymore. They cared about protecting themselves. One of the financing representatives quietly stepped away from the table and began making phone calls. Another started gathering documents into separate folders. Across the room, two investors privately discussed whether they should leave immediately. Fear was spreading. Exactly as Mama Gloria predicted. Then came the moment that shattered what remained of Darnell's credibility. One of the investors asked a simple question. "Mr. Ellis, when exactly did Mrs. Ellis authorize these negotiations?" A reasonable question, a harmless question, a fatal question. Darnell answered without thinking. He provided a date. Unfortunately, that date happened to be 3 days after my emergency surgery. The room went silent, complete silence. because everyone suddenly understood what that meant. I slowly looked at him. "That's interesting," I said. Darnell immediately realized his mistake. Too late. The damage was done. 3 days after my surgery, I continued. While I was hospitalized, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The financing representative slowly lowered his pen. One attorney stopped writing entirely. Marcus Hill looked like a man realizing he had stepped onto very thin ice. Darnell tried correcting himself. Then he tried explaining. Then he tried changing the subject. Nothing worked. The room had already reached its conclusion. He wasn't a businessman closing a transaction. He was a man trapped inside his own lies. Every attempt to escape only tightened the trap further. Then I finally spoke directly to the investors. Not as a victim, not as an angry wife. As the actual owner of the building, I explained the trust structure. I explained my grandfather's intentions. I explained the protections attached to the asset. Most importantly, I explained that anyone continuing to pursue the transaction after receiving notice of fraud could expose themselves to serious legal consequences. The effect was immediate. Chairs shifted, conversations stopped, eyes widened. One investor closed his folder entirely. Another stood up and began gathering his belongings. Suddenly, millions of dollars no longer looked exciting. They looked dangerous. Across the room, Darnell watched his dream die in real time. The investors who spent weeks praising him no longer trusted him. The brokers who expected commissions no longer wanted association. The attorneys who supported the deal were quietly distancing themselves. Everything he built was collapsing. Yet somehow, the worst part was still coming. Because just as another investor announced his intention to withdraw from the transaction entirely, the private dining room doors opened. Several new people entered. None carried champagne. None carried presentation materials. And judging by the expression that instantly appeared on Darnell's face, he knew exactly who they were before anyone else did. The moment the private dining room doors opened, every conversation in the room died instantly. The shift was so sudden that even the waiters stopped moving. For several seconds, nobody seemed to know whether to speak or remain silent. Then I saw the expressions spreading across the faces of the investors. Confusion, concern, recognition, fear. The newcomers weren't dressed like brokers. They weren't attorneys representing buyers. They weren't members of the media. They carried themselves differently. Calm, focused, professional. The kind of people who entered a room already knowing exactly why they were there. Darnell's reaction told me everything I needed to know. The color drained from his face so quickly, it almost looked painful. Until that moment, he had still been fighting, still searching for a way to regain control, still convincing himself he could talk his way out of the disaster unfolding around him. The instant he saw the people entering the room, that confidence disappeared. Completely. One of the men stepped forward and quietly identified himself. The title alone was enough to trigger another wave of panic throughout the room. Nobody shouted. Nobody accused anyone of a crime. They simply requested a conversation. Yet somehow, that felt far more terrifying than a public arrest ever could. Investors immediately began gathering their belongings. Attorneys started making phone calls. Several attendees moved toward the exits without waiting for permission. The deal was dead. Everyone knew it. The only remaining question was how much damage would follow. Darnell attempted one final recovery. He forced a smile and insisted there had been a misunderstanding. Administrative confusion, documentation errors, communication problems, the same excuses he had repeated all evening. This time, nobody listened. The room had moved beyond explanations. Evidence had already spoken. Then one of the investigators calmly placed a folder on the conference table. Watching Darnell's expression as he recognized the documents was almost surreal. The man looked as though someone had punched him in the stomach. Inside the folder sat records connected to multiple financial transactions, offshore transfers, unauthorized account movements, asset reallocations, communications involving lenders. Every page represented another secret he thought remained hidden. The investors who had not already left quickly began doing so. No profit opportunity was worth staying connected to what was rapidly becoming a catastrophe. Marcus Hill remained seated longer than most. Not because he wanted to, because he couldn't seem to accept what was happening. The transaction he spent months organizing had collapsed in less than an hour. Worse, His name now appeared alongside a deal attracting scrutiny from multiple directions. For a broker whose reputation depended on trust, the implications were devastating. Then the final secret emerged. The secret that explained everything. The secret even Mama Gloria had only partially understood. One of the investigators asked a simple question regarding outstanding obligations. At first, Darnell refused to answer. Then he denied the existence of any problem. Then evidence appeared. Loan agreements, payment schedules, collection notices. The truth became impossible to avoid. Darnell wasn't merely in debt, he was drowning in it. More than $500,000. The number seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. Even Shanice looked stunned. For the first time all evening, genuine confusion crossed her face. She didn't know. She had no idea. Every promise, every luxury plan, every future he sold her, built on a lie. Darnell had never been preparing a glamorous new life. He had been trying to survive financial destruction. Suddenly everything made sense. The stolen $80,000, the forged signatures, the rush to sell the building, the desperate timeline, the manipulation. None of it was about freedom. It was about panic. Pure panic. Months earlier, several high-risk investments collapsed. Instead of accepting the losses, Darnell borrowed money, then borrowed more, then borrowed again. Each new loan covered the previous mistake. Each new lie covered the previous lie. Eventually, the entire structure became impossible to maintain. By the time I entered the hospital, he was out of options. The building represented his final escape route. Sell it quickly, take the money, pay the debts, start over. At least that was the fantasy. Reality had other plans. Across the room, Shanice slowly backed away from him. The movement was subtle but impossible to miss. Earlier that evening, she stood at his side. Now she looked at him like a stranger. The transformation happened in real time. Loyalty built on money rarely survives when the money disappears. Darnell noticed it too. His eyes followed her. For a brief moment, I saw something unexpected. Fear. Not fear of investigators. Not fear of lawsuits. Fear of being abandoned. The same fear he forced on everyone else. The same fear he forced on me. The irony was almost perfect. Then another complication arrived. One of the investigators received a phone call. After listening briefly, he thanked the caller and ended the conversation. The expression on his face changed immediately. "Mr. Ellis," he said calmly, "there's additional information we need to discuss." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Darnell looked exhausted, defeated, yet somehow still hoping for a miracle. The miracle never came. Additional financial records had surfaced. More communications, more transfers, more evidence. The hole beneath him continued growing larger. Meanwhile, outside the restaurant, events were unfolding that Darnell never anticipated. Several lenders had already learned the transaction was collapsing. Once lenders become nervous, they move quickly. Calls were being made. Accounts were being reviewed. Relationships were being reevaluated. The protective wall Darnell spent years constructing was disappearing piece by piece. Then the final humiliation arrived. One of the largest investors in the room stood up and addressed everyone present. He announced that his group was withdrawing completely. Effective immediately. No negotiations, no revisions, no future discussions. Others followed, one after another. The exodus became impossible to stop. Within minutes, nearly every meaningful participant had abandoned the deal. Chairs emptied, folders disappeared, conversations ended. What remained looked nothing like a celebration. It looked like a crime scene after everyone realized they were standing too close. Through it all, Mama Gloria remained silent. She simply watched, not with satisfaction, not with revenge, with sadness. Because no matter what Darnell had done, he was still her son. Watching him destroy his own life carried a pain few people could understand. Finally, Darnell looked toward her. "Mom." The word barely escaped his mouth. Mama Gloria held his gaze for several seconds. Then she answered quietly, "I tried to save you long before tonight." The sentence hit harder than any accusation could have. Darnell lowered his eyes. For the first time all evening, he had nothing left to say. No explanation, no manipulation, no performance, just silence. The empire he spent months building had collapsed in less than 2 hours. The money was gone. The investors were leaving. Shanice was backing away. The deal was dead. Yet as devastating as everything felt, the story still wasn't over. Because while everyone inside the room focused on the collapse of the transaction, another legal process had already begun. And by sunrise the next morning, Darnell Ellis would discover that losing the building was only the beginning of what he was about to lose. By the time the sun rose over Chicago the next morning, the man who had spent months trying to steal my future was finally facing the reality he had spent even longer trying to avoid. For years, Darnell believed consequences were things that happened to other people. Every time he made a reckless decision, someone rescued him. Every time he lied, someone believed him. Every time he crossed a line, he somehow convinced himself that he would find a way out. That illusion ended the night the deal collapsed. What happened afterward moved much faster than even I expected. Once the investors withdrew, the entire structure holding Darnell's plan to get Mumba began disintegrating. Financial institutions started conducting reviews. Attorneys began distancing themselves from anything connected to the transaction. Several lenders demanded immediate explanations regarding outstanding obligations. Accounts that once appeared stable suddenly attracted scrutiny. The pressure came from every direction at once. By mid-morning, news of the failed acquisition had spread through professional circles. Calls stopped being returned. Meetings were canceled. Opportunities disappeared. People who spent months praising Darnell's vision suddenly wanted nothing to do with him. Reputation takes years to build, and only moments to destroy. Darnell learned that lesson the hard way. The legal consequences arrived next. Renee and the Chicago attorneys moved quickly. Emergency protections were activated across the trust. Fraudulent authorizations were formally challenged. Financial records were secured. Every safeguard my grandfather spent decades putting into place finally did exactly what it had been designed to do: protect the family from the kind of person who believed they were smarter than the rules. For the first time since waking up in that hospital bed, I felt safe. Not because every problem had disappeared, but because the bleeding had finally stopped. The building was secure. The trust was secure. The future Darnell tried to sell was no longer in danger. A few days later, I returned home to Atlanta. Walking through my front door felt completely different than it had before. The house was still the same. The furniture was still the same. Yet something fundamental had changed. The illusion was gone. I no longer viewed the house as a symbol of a marriage. I viewed it as proof of survival. Shanice was already gone. The moment the money disappeared, so did she. Her departure surprised absolutely nobody. Not Mama Gloria, not Uncle Jerome, not me. People who build relationships around greed usually discover that greed is incapable of loyalty. According to several mutual acquaintances, she left Chicago less than 48 hours after the deal collapsed. The apartment she expected Darnell to pay for became someone else's problem. The luxury future she imagined vanished before it ever truly began. I never saw her again. As for Darnell, the months that followed were brutal. Every attempt to recover only seemed to create new difficulties. Legal battles continued. Financial obligations remained. Professional relationships dissolved. The image he spent years building inside the business community never recovered. The most shocking part was how quickly people moved on. For months, I believed Darnell possessed enormous influence. Then I watched that influence disappear almost overnight. The truth is that many people aren't loyal to success. They're loyal to the appearance of success. Once the appearance vanished, so did they. Several weeks after returning home, I received a request to meet with him. At first, I refused. Then Mama Gloria asked me to reconsider. Not for reconciliation, not for forgiveness, for closure. Eventually, I agreed. The meeting took place in a small attorney's office. Nothing about the room felt dramatic. No shouting, no speeches, no final battle. Just two people sitting across a table from one another. When Darnell walked into the room, I barely recognized him. The confidence was gone. The arrogance was gone. Even the way he carried himself had changed. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he finally looked at me and said the words I once spent years hoping to hear. "I'm sorry." Strangely, hearing them didn't bring satisfaction. It didn't erase anything. It didn't repair anything. It simply confirmed what I already knew. He understood exactly what he had destroyed. He apologized for the affair. He apologized for the money. He apologized for the lies. He apologized for abandoning me in the hospital. He apologized for everything. Years earlier, I probably would have cried. Years earlier, I probably would have searched for a way to save what remained, but that version of me no longer existed. I listened quietly until he finished. Then I thanked him for the apology. Nothing more, nothing less, because forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. I could release the anger without reopening the door. I could let go without inviting him back into my life. When the meeting ended, Darnell asked one final question. Do you think you'll ever trust me again? I considered the question carefully before answering. No. The honesty wasn't cruel. It was simply true. Some damage heals. Some damage teaches. And some damage permanently changes the shape of a relationship. Ours belonged to the third category. A few months later, the divorce became official. For the first time in years, my life felt peaceful. Not perfect. Peaceful. There is a difference. The building continued generating income. The trust remained protected. New opportunities appeared. Old wounds slowly healed. Most importantly, I learned something I wish I had understood much earlier. Strength is not measured by how much pain you can endure. Strength is measured by what you refuse to tolerate once you recognize your own worth. Through everything, Mama Gloria remained part of my life. Many people found that unusual. I didn't. Family isn't always defined by blood or marriage certificates. Sometimes family is the person who chooses the truth when lies would be easier. Sometimes family is the person who stands beside you when standing beside you costs them something. Mama Gloria lost a son she thought she knew. Yet she never lost her integrity. I will always respect her for that. Uncle Jerome remained exactly who he had always been. Quiet, reliable, protective. The kind of man who solves problems without asking for recognition. Looking back, I honestly don't know how I would have survived that week without him. Every story eventually reaches a moment where masks fall away and people reveal who they truly are. Darnell revealed himself through greed. Shanice revealed herself through opportunism. Mama Gloria revealed herself through courage. Uncle Jerome revealed himself through loyalty. And I revealed something to myself that I never fully understood before. I was stronger than the people trying to break me. The night I woke up alone in that hospital bed, I thought my life was ending. In reality, something else was happening. The lies were ending. The manipulation was ending. The version of my life built around someone else's deception was ending. And once all of that finally collapsed, something better had room to grow. Darnell thought stealing my money, my security, and my future would destroy me. Instead, his betrayal gave me the one thing he never intended to give me: freedom. And sometimes the greatest revenge isn't watching someone lose everything. Sometimes the greatest revenge is building a life so full of peace, purpose, and self-respect that you no longer care whether they are watching. The day my husband abandoned me after surgery, he believed he was walking toward a better future. The truth was much simpler. He was walking away from the best thing he ever had, and by the time he finally understood that, it was far too late.